So we now have Panasonic joining the fray of the full-frame mirrorless camera market, releasing the S1 and the S1R. So you've got the S1, which is a lower-end 24 megapixel camera, and then the S1R, which is a higher resolution 47 megapixel camera. So Panasonic have opted for the same setup as Nikon have with the Z6, Z7, and Sony with the A7 III and A7R III. So while everyone else is running at least a two-model setup with a low-resolution camera and a higher resolution camera, Canon have gone for one camera somewhere in the middle of the two with the 30 megapixel EOS R. Now, the EOS R, to a lot of people, was a bit of a disappointment when it was released. Bearing in mind, it's more expensive than the Sony and the Nikon and not much cheaper than the Panasonic S1, but doesn't have anywhere near the same feature sets as them. It was criticised for no in-body stabilisation, one single SD card slot, so not even a faster format than SD, the relatively slow shooting speed of 5 frames a second with AF tracking, the crop factor in 4K, the lack of 1080 at 120 frames a second, the lack of continuous shooting in silent shutter, the lack of eye autofocus in continuous mode, and that weird touch bar that nobody seemed to like. So there was quite a few things of the EOS R that I've seen people criticise. Now, I appreciate it's not a flagship camera, I appreciate it's their first attempt at a camera, and I also appreciate that those missing features are not going to be an issue for everybody. If you're primarily only shooting stills and you are working in environments like studios or shooting landscapes, all those missing features probably not going to be that much of a problem for you. However, it is just a disappointment that all the other manufacturers are putting everything into one camera and Canon kind of aren't. But it was made clear that this was not a flagship option from Canon, and before the EOS R was even released, there was talk of other models coming in the lineup. The initial talk was of a sports variant of the EOS R, so essentially a mirrorless 1DX to try and rival the likes of the A9. Then there was talk of a high-resolution version, like a mirrorless replacement for the 5DS and the 5DSR. Now, that could potentially take a fight to the A7R III, the Z7, and the S1R. However, is that actually going to work for Canon? Because if you look back at the 5DS versus the 5D Mark III that was built on, with the increase in resolution came a drop in speed. So it went from 6 frames a second down to 5 frames a second. Then Canon updated the 5D3 with the 5D4. That went from 6 up to 7 frames a second. The EOS R was supposed to be a mirrorless 5D Mark IV, but it can only shoot 5 frames a second. Which means if we see a high-resolution version of the EOS R, how slow is that going to be shooting? 3 frames a second, maybe? Would that be an appealing camera? Now, more recently, there's been products filed by Canon which are speculated to be a new mirrorless camera on the way, but not a high-resolution and not a sports model. The talk is now that Canon are going to be producing a lower-end version of the EOS R, and this worries me. While the EOS R was branded on paper as being like a mirrorless 5D Mark IV, in reality, it's not. While it carries the same sensor as the 5D Mark IV, and it has the same restricted video capabilities of the 5D Mark IV, it's only got one SD card slot like the 6D Mark II, and it can only shoot 5 frames a second, which is slower than the 6D Mark II. So it's not really a mirrorless 5D Mark IV. It's not really a mirrorless 6D Mark II either. It's like a mirrorless 5.5D. Now, the patents filed for this new mirrorless camera state it as having a resolution of 26.2 megapixels, which happens to be exactly the same resolution as the sensor in the 6D Mark II. And if we know anything about Canon, they're not likely to have made a brand new sensor from scratch that just happens to have the same resolution as the sensor that they've already made barely a year ago that's only been used once. So it seems far more likely that Canon are just going to use the 6D Mark II sensor, tweak it slightly, namely add a crap ton of phase detect autofocus points like they did with the EOS R, and then drop it into a mirrorless body. However, just changing the sensor from a 30 megapixel sensor to a 26.2 megapixel sensor isn't enough to differentiate the two as two completely different models. So if Canon are going to bring this out as an entry-level full-frame mirrorless camera, they're going to need to restrict the features versus the EOS R, which is alarming because the features of the EOS R are already pretty well restricted compared to the competition. So what exactly are Canon going to restrict? Probably no 4K video at all, like the 16 Mark II doesn't have. Maybe 4 frames a second shooting? Maybe no memory card slots, or drop it to a UHS 1 like the 16 Mark II. I was going to say they could get rid of the touch bar, but that would actually be an upgrade. So maybe they'll add 2 touch bars. Unless Canon are planning some crazy marketing strategy of bringing out this camera in like the £1,300 price bracket, I don't see that as being an appealing option. I think Canon need to accept now that since this Sony a7 III came out, the benchmark of what is entry level has shot up. So the EOS R, less features than the a7 III and £200 more expensive. I think Canon need to just accept the cock-up that they've made and deem that the EOS R is essentially an entry-level full-frame mirrorless camera. And they need to focus on bringing out a higher-end model, a better version, to try and take a fight to the competition. So maybe a high-resolution camera like an EOS R or an EOS R SR, and come out with a more sports and wildlife focused full frame mirrorless. So take the 1DX Mark II sensor, drop it into a full frame mirrorless body, give it 14 frames a second with a mechanical shutter. That would make it a selling point over the A9, because that can only do 5 frames a second. Suddenly you've now got a camera that in some way bests everything else on the market. But what are your thoughts and opinions on the matter? Do you think Canon are playing a smart tactical game? Do you think they've gone a bit delusional? Do you think they need to change their mirrorless lineup? And if so, what should they be doing with it? Leave your thoughts and comments in the box down below. Thank you so much for stopping by, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.